a bit of a, I think, useful but hopefully short idea to address that hopefully is easy to sort of, I guess, cover by virtue of the fact that I've already made a bunch of videos that demonstrate this. But um, there's a little, I think, uh, interesting thing that I've encountered for the majority of my life that I think is both somewhat true and somewhat untrue. Um, which is that a lot of people, when they sort of listen to my ideas, and the way that I talk is, I get accused is obviously a really strong word, but good enough. It's alleged by people that I encounter not infrequently that I'm very black and white. Um, and I think that this is worth like going over with two regards. I think firstly, when I was younger, I very much was, but from a position of ignorance, which is to say that like uh, I thought I knew things that I didn't, and I thought that I understood things better than I did, and um, I have a brain that's really primed for patterns. So where I think I see patterns, I then say, this is the pattern. I see it, and so it is very black and white. Um, and I think that that kind of like opinion, it's like, yeah, that should be delegitimized. But I think that when you say, oh, you see this very black and white, um, you know, what you actually ultimately end up doing is delegitimizing opinions of well-informed people as well. Whereas I think the criticism I should have faced then is that I was missing nuance in my understanding. Um, the thing that I face now, which I think is very interesting, is that I still encounter at times these statements that I ultimately see things as very black and white, and I think nothing could be further from the truth. It's that I know that the situation isn't black and white, but I'm unwilling to use that as a excuse to not actually make some kind of a decision about how the situation seems. Um, and I think it's ultimately because I'm very willing to change my mind. And so what I mean on that is, if we start from a position of thinking about the philosophy of ethics, newsflash for those of you who haven't studied, unequivocally there is no ethics. It's not real. The universe is cold and uncaring. There is no such thing as some kind of objective morality. Anybody who wants to convince you of that is lying. And most of the time they don't realize that they're lying. But if we're talking like logically constructing ethics, there is no way to logically construct ethics without just making some arbitrary decision, right? And that is because ethics is not some kind of fundamental thing of the universe. It's something that we construct. It's a byproduct of, a survival mechanism that comes as a result of, living in societies, which is, a cool thing that we've developed as humans, right? And there's this weird interplay with sort of the behaviors that we have as humans that has like shifted from one of competing with each other versus, to eventually being one of cooperation. But there's certain like uh, behavioral mechanisms, internal brain mechanisms. I'm speaking very broadly and untechnically. If you wanted to pin me down, I'd probably say I'm very like surface level informed on this. But if you looked at sort of behavioral evolution of humans, you'd find experts far more informed on this. But there's certain things that sort of artifacts of a time of competing against each other that sort of modern society very much get in the way of our ability to cooperate. And so the ethics that we have, historically, I think it's safe to say have largely been like constructed through both like cultural and community, and then at times like outsource ultimately to sort of like a more formalized like religious doctrine, that you would say has like ultimately come from sort of like the cultural like evolution of like a society or of a group. Um, but like it's there vaguely to sort of, keep us all in line, and give us reason to not just devolve into the base sort of things that our brain at times desires. Um, it's all made up. It's not real. And like specifically what I mean by that as well is, okay, well, we've got really cool um, mythos for lack of a better term. Um, in Western society, like I grew up on stories like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, right? Or of Robin Hood, right? So it's like The Boy Who Cried Wolf is a story that is effectively just say, hey, don't lie and manipulate people, otherwise you might die. That's what that story is, right? Like it's, hey, there's this boy and he's bored whilst he's taking care of sheep or insert whatever. He pretends that like his life's in danger, the sheep are in danger. The whole village comes out to try and rescue him. They find out he's lying. He does it more than once, and then eventually, right? And it's like the story might be like on the third time, but like the analogy is that if eventually you keep lying and manipulating people, then no one will help you, and that means you can die because like the way we as humans work to deal with threats larger than our individual self is that we rely on each other, and that there's like a cost to lying and manipulating people that eventually means you might be like kicked out of the group. um, and so it's like, cool, I understand all of that, and then I'll say, with absolute certainty that the actions and behaviors of certain kinds of people in society, like, I'll just say, I think those people should be erased. Like, their existence should stop for how they negatively detract from the lived experience of so many other people. They're effectively and functionally being a boy who cried wolf, right? Um, and it's like, oh, yeah, people come at me. They'll say that's very black and white, um, without realizing that, like, I actually don't care about the mechanism that brings about the erasure. Um, it's like, does there need to be a metaphorical wolf, or does there need to be a metaphorical, like, inaction on society that leads to this metaphorical wolf? And it's like, I don't care. I'm not committed, because there is no right answer. And that I think is lost at times because I'm willing to say that I think that because there's no answer, that actually for humanity, there is a real like answer for what would like at least be like a net benefit, which is that the specific actions of certain kinds of people are removed from their ability to impact society. And it's like that you can definitely say there's like an objective answer to that for certain people within society, right? But I do an intellectual shorthand when I talk about it, and I will say that, hey, maybe the world would be better without these kinds of people, right? Um, but I think that's like something that I think I just sort of want to like address. It's like, um, just because I speak with like a degree of certainty, um, doesn't mean I don't have all of this nuance backed up behind it to understand that actually, there is no black and white answer. Everything's made up. You're allowed to do whatever you want, and it's just that there are like, uh, statistically speaking, more likely outcomes as a result of doing one thing over doing another thing. And so when I speak in this sort of like at times black and white nature, it's derived from the fact that I have a really good intuition over the fact that I've like looked and learnt about this a lot and been wrong about it a lot to be able to then say this kind of thing is very likely to be the best possible thing for this kind of scenario to elicit this kind of like change. Um, but explaining that in any short amount of time that people are willing to listen is far more difficult. So people put up with me talking for far longer at the best of times anyway. It's something that I, on the one hand, am self-conscious of, but on the other hand, I'm not willing to change that aspect of myself, which is that, like, I do think really hard about things and do have this capacity um, to maintain a very large picture of very complicated, interconnected ideas. And rather than explaining all the interconnected ideas and taking all that time to lead somebody along who may not be able to keep all of them in mind when I eventually say my big, large picture analysis, I will often do for me what feels like a very brief overview and give them the larger picture analysis, and what to a lot of people then sounds like, you're thinking of this very black and white. And where I'm going to, I guess, point to some real life examples of this where I think it's like objectively true that I understand nuance, but I also understand more importantly that at times like decisions need to be made based on incomplete information, and that like the black and whitedness that I speak with is from that perspective. There's two examples that I think are worth talking about. And so one is I was a juror on a historic sexual assault case. Interestingly enough, for uh, a situation that could have easily existed within my own field of work at the time. Without getting too much into it, I have spent a huge amount of time working with people for a large number of years, particularly young people. And at the time that I was on this jury, I was involved in that work. And everything about the case was incredibly reminiscent of the situations that I found myself in over a large period of time. And it was a very long case in terms of months. It was about 2 months of evidence. And then we went to deliberation, and without giving any details away, there was some friction when it came to how we went about assessing the evidence. And there was a majority side with regards to how it was being interpreted that I also actually fell on. But my job was not to take the easy path. And so when it came to actually assessing the evidence, there were particular examples that I found when it came to the charges that we were there to deliberate on, where despite my overall alignment with this majority, I found very specific reasons why certain charges could not align with that overall perspective, and why certain other like judgments on those charges had to, objectively speaking, with regards to sort of how the law functions, be ruled in opposition to that. But at the same time, the minority that were large picture, seeing it in a different way to the rest of the group, were also seeing it differently because they had this flawed logic around how our legal system here works and the specific instructions we'd been given by the judge. And they were committed emotionally, the same way the majority group was committed emotionally to a feeling, to a general outcome that they desired. And I did the best that I could in the time that I had. And there were people who were really grateful at the end of it all for my commitment to this, to the bitter end. But I was committed, no matter what, to addressing the flaws in their logic, whilst also addressing the flaws in the logic of the group that I agreed with as a whole, right? And so there was this weird interplay where big picture, definitely there was basically, the way a jury works and the way we had to assess it, there was definitely a certain assessment of the situation that was, for all intents and purposes, the truth. That on a small scale, absolutely fell apart in a small number of the specific charges that we were deliberating on, and that you could even look at the reason why it fell apart in those specific instances and then explicitly understand why they fell apart and didn't in any way detract from the overall perspective. There were specific reasons because of how our legal system works, because of the evidence that was presented, and errors in just how it was presented, things that were questioned, things that weren't picked up by the Crown and the defense, at the time. That even they didn't realize that I only picked up, I only raised at the end before deliberation. At some point, it was too late for them to retroactively fix. So that's one example of like my confidence in my ability to really keep a beat on a big picture perspective whilst having a really good grasp of the small details. And the second was then a personal experience that I went through in my field of work, which was very similar to the case that I was a juror on. But I unfortunately was on the reporting side of, for lack of a better term. And I remember having a conversation with somebody in my line of work about the situation as I was going through a very complicated situation with regards to how I went about reporting things. That I had also sought my own legal advice on, thankfully, and was not swayed by other people's decisions once I understood largely how my role had to function. But in speaking to another person who didn't understand that, and in going through a conversation with them and seeking their advice, they sort of alleged the same thing that I'm addressing of, oh, you're seeing this very black and white. As if to say that I was missing the nuance of the situation and the grey of the situation. And, it makes me feel very emotional because it was specifically being utilized to effectively defend the criminal activity or the alleged criminal activity of this person that I had to make reports about. And I just remember thinking that I understood so clearly the complexity ethically of the situation that I was in, and that it was incredibly frustrating to me that that was being thrown in my face, because it said to me immediately that this person has no comprehension that ultimately, regardless of how ethically complicated the situation is, a judge will expect a black and white decision with regards to all of the actions that I take if ever I find myself in the position that my inaction leads to things that eventually are actually addressed by our justice system later. And what I mean by that is, without any detail, in Australia we have this thing called mandatory reporting, where if you are volunteering or working in an employed sense with children, that there are legal obligations you have when you are doing that, not just with regards to the children that you work with, but generally with regards to any child that if you find out about a situation, certain kinds of situation, you have a legal mandate to report that to the government, even if it's got nothing to do with you or the children that you work with. That's what being a mandatory reporter is. Now, is that something that is realistically enforceable? Probably not. But the system works if you assume that it is, in the sense that the legal mandate of mandatory reporters is just as much there to punish those who don't report as it is to protect people who make difficult decisions to report. Like I did. It was, in fact, incredibly easy for me to not care about any of my circumstance once I'd confirmed in seeking my own advice that I was legally mandated to report. It made no difference to me then. Anybody who appealed to this idea of greyness or the ethical complexity of the situation, but not as a deference of responsibility or of my humanity or my empathy, but rather as one to say, well, yes, the situation is complicated, but there is a line that has been crossed that cannot be uncrossed with regards to the things that I have to do as a result of this complicated situation. And instead of then there being any means through which I could be swayed or pressured, there being a legal mandate makes it very easy for me to never have to justify to other people my actions. And instead, I can always just say, I did what the law required me to do. And the pressure from anybody to get me to not do that then is also very easy to categorize, regardless of how they might feel about it. That they might think that they're being motivated by their humanity or their empathy. It, in fact, is very easy to say, if you were being motivated by humanity and empathy in this particular situation, you would be encouraging this person to make a report, because the reporting system does not actually in any way cause any criminal or legal consequence for anybody that you make reports about. So the system is a zero-fault system. If you make a report based on a genuine thing, you're not tricking the system, not trying to lie, you're 100% protected. If you have acted beyond reproach in your situation, then no report to the system will ever land you in hot water, right? And there's this very, very high degree of professionalism that's then also required of anybody acting in a position where they are volunteering or caring with children. And that, I think, is ultimately why I feel very strongly about people accusing me of having this very black and white way of seeing the world. And it's that it just betrays their own ignorance of who I am. It's you don't know me. You don't understand how much I think about these things and have thought about these things, and all the ways in which I ultimately understand that maybe it is incredibly grey, but certain things have to have decisions made about them, even in that greyness, in order to have a society that functions. Because otherwise we can just defer to, well, it's too grey to do anything or to act all the time. And that's, I think, a far more problematic thing for society in how it allows situations where people have power and people have control and people are causing harm as a result of the inaction, as a result of the bystanders who think it's too grey to make some kind of decision about. And look at me, here I am thinking, oh yes, I'll address this in a short period of time, and we're 25 minutes deep, but I'll stop discussing it here.